what we lived through, and the fruits that we enjoyed from our forefathers back in the 70s, who really spearheaded an amazing modernization transformation of the Army. And it's the same effort that we are endeavoring to do here today. My experience, I came in the Army in '83, young lieutenant, field artillery. They taught me about air-land battle. And quite frankly, I didn't know a whole lot about the Army. But I learned very quickly. And I was amazed at what I walked into back in those early days of the 1980s. We had some amazing new modernization platforms. Everybody here has probably a story about the first time they saw the M1 Abrams tank rolling down the road, or that Bradley fighting vehicle, or the Patriot air defense system, or the Black Hawk, or the Apache. I would tell you, I never once in my entire career thought to myself, how did we get there? How did we go from somebody's idea back in the 60s and 70s to that beast of a weapons platform that we had when I joined the Army? Frankly, I was in elementary school and high school when a lot of that was conceptualized. It never crossed my mind. But when that M1, or that Bradley fighting vehicle, came rumbling over the berm, or that Apache came up over that crest, I tell you what, I was one happy guy. I was young, I was impressionable, but I will tell you, when me and my fellow lieutenants, and many of you here in the room, when we saw that Abrams tank, and we saw that Bradley fighting vehicle rolling through the plains of the Fulda Gap, we said, whoa. We said, whoa. And I was really very proud to be a part of that Army, and to be a part of something that had took probably 10, 15 years, really, of those who came before us to get us to that point. We felt good about ourselves. We knew we were a part of a formidable force. And we knew if we had to go toe-to-toe, that we liked our chances. So I think we're in a very similar place today. We're at an inflection point in the Army's history. Certainly the security environment is quite a bit different. In some ways, it's very much the same. Soviet Union, Russia. But I would tell you, we got two peer competitors out there. Both of them have advanced capabilities. Certainly, 21st century warfare is much, much different than when we were young officers and non-commissioned officers back in the 80s. Today we have the cyber domain, we have the space domain, where back in those days we were focused on air, land, and sea. And I don't think it's going to disappoint or surprise anybody. Counterinsurgency warfare is not going away. It's going to be here for the unforeseeable future. But we've embarked on this journey over the last 3 years to address these threats that I would tell you is a level akin to what our forefathers back in the 60s and 70s did. And most importantly, when you walk out of this room, I want you to remember these words. We owe this to our country. We have grown up in a country, guys, I'm 60 years old. Some of you are older than me, younger than me. We grew up in a country where we were fortunate to have freedom in the homeland for the entirety of my lifetime. We owe this to our country. We owe this to our countrymen to retain, to develop and retain competencies in every single one of those domains. And I would tell you, we owe it to our soldiers. The soldiers who are serving today and the kids in high school and college who want to serve their country tomorrow in the armed forces of the United States of America. We owe them the very best doctrine, and we're working hard on our doctrine. We owe them the very best training and education. We owe them the very best equipment, the very best leadership, and the very best resources that this country can pull together. Now, I get this, okay? This is a tall order. This is a very tall order to take the Army through a transformational change and to modernize us for the 21st century warfare that we all know. Well, what I've learned over the last 38 years of service in our Army, if you put the right people in the right positions and the right talent in the room, this country and this Army can do just about anything. But it comes at a price. I remember we were saying this 20 years ago, you guys. Freedom is not free. It comes at a price. And we all know this. Give me my first slide, please. Or maybe you guys want me to do it. Okay. So the President's budget request that we rolled out last Monday, about 8 days ago, is testimony to the fact that freedom is not free. There is a price here. Okay? But here are the very basics of the Army's budget. Secretary Mattis penned the National Defense Strategy and signed it in January of 18. That is the anchor. That is the strategic azimuth that governs all of our efforts. It still is today. OSD and the United States Army, Secretaries Esper and McCarthy, provided us guidance here in the last year and a half, that reiterates, provides clarity, and establishes priorities and sharpens that guidance. And it takes into account the fiscal considerations. We have the Army Plan. The Army Plan, this is Charlie Flynn leads this for us, our G3. But the Army Plan, which has a vision, it's a strategic plan, it's got planning guidance, it's got programming guidance. We do a thing called the Army Campaign Plan where we check ourselves periodically to make sure we're on this plan. That Army Plan and its 5 components is a manifestation of us taking all of that guidance and applying our Title X responsibilities to achieving that guidance. And lastly, we added 2 complementary pieces of guidance or plans to this menagerie. And it's the modernization and the people strategies. Everything we do, all of our resourcing efforts nest with the National Defense Strategy and those plans. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, go back. So when we talk about the Army budget, and we try to put it into some very broad categories or priorities. You can see those on the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. So in its very simplest form, we're trying to achieve the highest levels of readiness. We are modernizing. We have a lot of reform efforts going on. But none of this happens without the talented people that we have in the Army. So you're going to see throughout the entirety of the budget rollout season, you're going to see us discuss the Army budget with that framework in place. So I will tell you, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, there's your funding profile. Probably pretty familiar to you. But I would think, in my mind, what that represents is the commitment of the administration to the defense of our country. So you can see back in 16 and 17, we were around the $150 to $160 billion top line. And then we have bumped that up, and now we've grown that to around the $180 billion level. Okay, that's both between base and OCO. Next slide, please. Here are the themes. Just take a moment and look at those. Probably some of those are very familiar to you. Obviously, we're going to defeat our adversaries. We're going to maintain and build readiness. We're going to strengthen our ties with our partners and our allies. We're going to continue aggressive reforms, and we are going to invest and maintain our critical infrastructure. But what I would really like to do is to highlight a couple of things that were not on this slide last year. Everything starts with people. This is a top priority. You'll hear the chief say people first. This is a top priority. Nothing happens in the United States Army with talented people in the right place. I think that's sort of shouldn't surprise you that I say that, but for us, when it comes to managing our people, it is the bedrock of everything that we do. And it is absolutely a key focus. We're focusing on our end strength and a modest growth of our end strength. And the Secretary and the Chief have put some very effective talent management programs in place to help us manage the talent of our soldiers and our civilians. The other one I'd mention to you here is strategic readiness. So many of you are familiar with our focus on readiness and trying to get 2/3 of our active component BCTs to the highest level of readiness. We are very close. We're very close. We see ourselves achieving that. But that's not enough. We need to achieve strategic readiness. It's not enough to have a brigade combat team at the highest level of readiness. We got to get them to the fight, get them there fast, and get them there prepared as in the most timely manner that we can, and ready to fight as soon as they arrive. Next slide. So this is your Army budget. I like to tell everybody it's not rocket science, although we are investing in some rocket science this year. But this is not rocket science. As you look at this, you can see the upper half is our base budget. The base, of course, is meant to man, train, and equip the United States Army. And the bottom half is our overseas contingency funds budget, or operations, and that is meant to fund contingency operations. So if you take a moment and you look at that, no surprise, in our base budget, about 50% of our funding goes to pay for our people. Most of that, of course, is in our MilPERS account to pay for our soldiers. And then there is a slice of O&M that goes and pays for our civilian workforce. So 50% of the base budget. You can see there we've got over almost $34 billion that we're investing in research, development, and acquisition in the base. That's our modernization portfolio. And of course, O&M, really, when you talk about O&M, you talk about readiness, right? That is what we use to train and educate our soldiers. There's some smaller slices there. Milcon, about $1 billion. Some of you might remember Milcon used to be $4 and $5 billion about 10 years ago. And then there's another smaller slice of some smaller requirements that don't fit neatly into any of those categories. But look there and look at the growth. Look at the growth in the military personnel. So this budget has a 3.1% increase in pay for the soldiers. So that is great. Okay. I'll also tell you there is small growth in our active component end strength. We achieved at the end of 19 483,900 soldiers in the active component. We're going to get to 485 this year, and we're going to grow to 486 with this budget. So we're going to, in the active component, 486,000. Over 1 million soldiers across all three compos in this budget. There's growth in O&M, almost 4%, about a little over 3.5%. I will talk a little bit more about that on a subsequent slide. And then there is small growth in the procurement portfolio. Really the RDT&E and procurement portfolio, and procurement and RDT&E, the RDA portfolio that we have there. So there's some small growth there. More importantly, I think you're going to see some big investments in some of the things that we've worked on for the last few years. Huge increases in hypersonics, the Integrated Visual Augmentation System, known as IVAS, MSHORAD, some large increases in investments in those areas. The other thing I would tell you about the research, development, and acquisition, especially the RDT&E portion, we're starting to see the migration of funds coming out of the science and technology piece of RDT&E into the research and development. That's exactly what we would have expected, but that is in fact a trend that you'll see here in this budget. So OCO, we're coming in at about almost $25 billion. That is less than both this year and last year. And you can see that funds some of those contingency operations that you are very much familiar with, whether that's in Afghanistan or in Iraq. And it is also leveraged to fund our European deterrence initiative that we have going on there in Europe. And of course, there is almost $5 billion where we kind of serve as the banker for the Department of Defense to fund the Afghanistan Security Force Fund and what we call CTIF, which is the counter somebody help me. Train and Equip Fund down in theater. So you can see that. You can see that as well. So in total, this is about $178 billion. About $2.2 billion less than last year. But there's substantial. There's a balance here because there is a pretty sizable reduction in OCO, but there's growth in the base as we rolled this out. Let me have the next slide, please. So I took a few moments, and I really want everybody to have this slide. Put it in your hip pocket and help us as we tell the Army story. So remember I explained earlier, we kind of like to put this into some categories or some priorities. And so there's your Army readiness priorities. And you can see there, heavy focus tactically at the small unit level. Some of you have heard, this is my squad. A lot of focus on the individual soldier and the smaller units. So we're putting a lot of emphasis on training in those areas. We've actually started this year and continuing next year with some changes to our initial entry training, and the duration of that and the rigor in some of our areas like infantry and armor. So some real changes there in the tactical readiness, and then in strategic readiness, you can see a lot of work's being done with our pre-positioned stocks. And we're trying to better configure those for combat. So we have this dynamic force employment. Part of that is Defender Pacific. Large amount of money going into Defender Pacific next year. I think it's over $350 million. Kind of similar to what we're doing this year in Europe. And then the SFABs, so the Security Force Assistance Brigades. Those brigades, I would tell you, are very important to strategic readiness, because what it does is it takes a portion of our force structure and dedicates them to the assistance roles and missions that they have. Why is that so important? Now we have our brigade combat teams not conducting that mission so they can be better prepared to conduct their core mission. And so we've got 5 SFABs in the active component, regionally aligned, and we have an SFAB that we're building in the Army National Guard. And then we're doing some work on Mobile Force Generation Initiative. So a lot of work going into preparing our installations for power projection. So there is a real focus when we sit there and we look at our what we call SRM, our Sustainment, Restoration, and Modernization accounts, what we use to invest in existing infrastructure. A lot of that is focused on taking care of the soldiers and this power projection platform. So you'll see that it's in the details, granted, but that's a big focus of where we're putting some of our infrastructure money. So let me talk about people for just a minute. You heard me talk about the in-strength growth and the pay increases, but I will tell you we're doing a lot to help manage the talent of the force. So last year, the Army stood up the Talent Management Task Force. We've got different programs ongoing right now. Right now we have a system that allows a soldier to go in and say, hey, this is where I'd like to serve. We were able to do that before with our preference statements. But now you also have the unit saying, I'd like that soldier to serve in this unit. So that's called AIM 2. We're doing a battalion commander assessment program. We just conducted an assessment here this past month. So what that is we're making sure when we pick a young officer to command a battalion, let's make sure we did a good job of picking them, and let's have them go through an assessment program. And so we have done that, and I would tell you probably really tantamount to the success of all this is we have got to get IPSA funded and functional, because IPSA is what's going to allow us to manage our talent. So all of those things are part and parcel to the talent management work that we've been doing. And then I suppose many of you have heard about the 5 initiatives for quality of life that the Secretary of the Army and the Chief have championed. Housing, healthcare, child and youth services, spousal employment, and PCSs. So all of us have, and probably not all of those, but many of those, we've actually have a personal experience with those, and our leadership knows how important that is to the quality of our families and our family life, and so we're spending some time actually working in those 5 areas. And the third category is the modernization category. So I think over the last 3 years, you guys, you can appreciate, we have done quite a fabulous job, in my mind, of organizing ourselves to modernize the Army. Whether it was standing up the Army Futures Command a year and a half, 2 years ago, and then establishing the 8 CFTs or the 6 modernization priorities that you see down there. With that modernization, though, I would tell you probably the thing that has really been most helpful is what we've done both in modernization and in the area of reform. And so many of you are familiar with the term night court or deep dives, but I would tell you 2 years ago we started doing this. So we knew we had to help ourselves, right? We had to help ourselves. We had to take some hard decisions and optimize that $180 billion budget that we have. So 2 years ago, we did deep dives. We found 93 programs that we elected to eliminate, hard decisions, and 93 programs where we elected to administer some reductions in those. Why did we do that? We needed to free up some space. We needed to free up some dollars to pursue the modernization priorities that are required to support the National Defense Strategy. We continued that, and if you read the guidance that the Secretary of the Army put out, you guys, deep dives are here to stay. They're just like budget formulation. They're just like budget execution. They are an integral part of the PEBS process now in the United States Army. So we conducted what we're referred to as deep dive number 2. We found 41 programs that we needed to eliminate and another 39 that we have elected to reduce. A lot of other activities going on in the reform category. We needed to be better stewards of our dollars. And I would tell you, 2 years ago, the Secretary of the Army at that time, Secretary Esper, and then the under, both, I provided them a presentation, and they said, we got to do better. Okay, we established a program called the Commander's Accountability and Execution Review Program. It's amazing to watch this in play with the Secretary and the Chief, or the under and the Vice, sitting at the head of the table with 2- and 3-star commanders briefing their fiscal stewardship of their respective budgets. And that was absolutely what we needed to do to ensure that we optimize our purchasing power. We've made great improvements. I could tell you in the first year, we reduced our DOBs. Sorry to go technobabble on you. We reduced our DOBs by about 40% in our O&M accounts, and we think we'll have even greater progress in the second year of CARE. So we had to do that to optimize our purchasing power and rid ourselves of some of the inefficiencies of years past and how we spent some of our money. Audit's going pretty good, and it is important to be auditable. It allows you to see yourselves, and it allows you to find yet more areas where you need to be better stewards of your resources. We're going to be auditable in our working capital fund by the end of 21, and then the general fund, the bigger fund, by the end of 23. And so a lot of great progress there. Really appreciate the leadership of Mr. Moak, everybody, who just took the bull by the horns on this and really making some great progress in this area as well. Next slide. So let me leave you with a couple of final thoughts, and then Sidney, you'll get your chance here, brother. Okay. The Army soldiers serving today and the nation's sons and daughters that are in high school and college today who will serve in our Army in the future deserve the same commitment that many of us here in this room were privileged to back in the latter part of the last century. We owe this to our country, and we owe this to them. The Army will do its part. We will continue on with aggressive reforms. We'll do night court. We'll continue on with care. Our Army senior leaders fully engaged will make some of the tough decisions. If you thought some of these decisions that we've made here in the last couple of years were tough, I will tell you there's some really difficult decisions on the horizon. As some of these modernization programs, we start to pilot them and we start to want to field them, I tell you, that's when we're going to see some really tough decisions to be made. Because there are 31 signature programs. And I will tell you, most of them, if not all of them, are on a very good course. We're going to see prototypes in 23. We're going to see first units fielding in 24 and 25. And that'll continue through the remainder of this decade. But as the Secretary said, we are going to finish what we started. Made great progress. But here's what we need to be successful. No doubt, everybody who serves in the Army and everybody in this room is totally committed. I got that. But we need the full support of this budget. This budget is $178 billion, and we need the full support from the Congress and from everybody here in this room and everybody throughout this vast enterprise that we interact with every day. We need full support for this budget. We need timely and predictable funding at a level commensurate with our requirements. You know where I'm going with this. These long continuing resolutions, they have a deleterious impact on the readiness of the Army, and I'm not just talking about current readiness, but I'm talking about future readiness and our modernization programs. When we have new starts, when we have production rate increases in our research and development and acquisition accounts, and we're under a CR, we get our hands tied. So we absolutely need to have timely and predictable funding, and we need a budget enacted on time. We need real purchasing power growth. If you look at that funding profile I just showed you, looks pretty flat, right? 178, 180. Well, when you factor in inflation, it's actually a downturn in our real purchasing power over the last few years. It's actually a downturn. This year, it's about a 1% downturn in real purchasing power. We need real purchasing power growth of 3 to 5%. And most importantly, none of this happens without talented people. None of this is going to happen without talented people. But the right skills, the right time, and the right place. It's been my privilege to be with you today. Thanks for having me. People first. Winning matters. Army strong.
Sir, thank you for being here today. Before I hand off the mic to Sidney, who's already raising his hand, I'll kick the questions off if that's okay. Sure. How will the Army approach execution of dynamic force employment, and how will it be resourced?
So it's mostly in our O&M account. It's a pretty sizable amount of money. Don't quote me on this. I believe it's over $500 million. It has to do with a lot of our doing EDREs, so emergency deployment readiness exercises, and Defender is obviously a big part of that. So we are doing Defenders every year, Defender series every year in both Europe and the Pacific. This year, obviously, the big Defender exercise is focused on the European theater. Next year will be the Pacific theater. But there are also activities in the Pacific this year and in Europe next year.
Hi.
Sydney, I called you out by name. You got to show some love here, man.
Yeah, no, that's.
All right.
I occasionally have warm feelings for others, but I try to suppress that. Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. I'm actually like the breakfast brought to you today by Leidos, who let me sit in their reserved seating when I slipped in late. You said that this is a period very like the 1980s, the introduction of the Big Five, airland battle. And of course, I couldn't help but Googling the budget trends. And of course, the difference is in the 80s, the budget didn't stop growing and turn down until 86, after we'd actually started fielding all those Big Five things. Now we are in the prototype stage, and the budget, as you say, is already turning down. So, how do we find headroom for those things to increase, to actually move from R&D into production? And B, how do we persuade the people giving the Army the money that this is a period like the 80s, should be like the 80s, not a period like, the long valley of the shadow from Crusader, Comanche, and FCS, which still casts a shadow on, every time the Army asks for modernization funds.
So, you know what? I think that's a great question. Thanks. Thank you for that. Here's what I would say. Number one, I think we've got a very strong and consistent message. Number two, we are showing progress in all of those modernization efforts that you've seen. I would also tell you the fact that we are so aggressively pursuing reforms across the entire footprint. We are so aggressively pursuing reforms to ensure that we optimize the purchasing power of the budget that we are given. All of that is very compelling, but I would think at the end of the day, much of the reforms that we have realized in our deep dives, those are going to become probably smaller and smaller. And so for us to be able to fund and to pursue all of those modernization priorities, that is tantamount to success. That is tantamount to us being able to support the national defense strategy and protect the national security interests of this country. And we can't have just some of them, because they are all integrated and they are all necessary to conduct multi-domain operations and large-scale combat operations. And I would tell you, I think the freedom of this country depends on it.
Hi, Matt Baynard, Defense Daily. This actually follows up a bit on Sydney's question and then a bit on what you touched at the end of your discussion, talking about how the choices are going to become tougher. So we saw in this budget request, the night court resulted in about 80 programs and $13.5 billion saved over the FIDIP. From the previous year, that was around $33 billion from over 180 programs. This past Friday, the Secretary mentioned how, that he called that number a bit tepid compared to the year before, and how choices are going to become tougher, but FY22 specifically will be a point of emphasis where there needs to be some big reforms made. So could that number rise, this time next year when we look at the number of programs cut and the number of dollars saved? Is that a kind of goal that is being aimed at, as Night Court continues on? Thank you.
So I would tell you the goal is not based upon anything numeric. The goal is to ensure that every dollar that we are spending in our modernization portfolios is a dollar well spent and is a dollar that is in support of the national defense strategy. Sitting through these night courts or these deep dives that many of us have done here over the last couple of years, that is the criteria by which we evaluate a program. Okay? Do we need this to conduct multi-domain operations, large-scale combat operations in support of the NDS? And so, for me, I don't personally see that deep dive number going up. I think we have identified a lot of the programs already in the first two go-rounds. So I don't necessarily see that number going up. That's why I tell you I think this budget needs some real growth in the coming years.
Hi, sir. Ashley Roki with Janes. Just to follow up on the two questions. As you've done the night court process, but then you've also taken some of the new programs, such as AMPV and the new self-propelled howitzer, and for various reasons, you've taken that money to sort of funnel it into modernization priorities as well. So what kind of decisions can we see on the horizon with these programs that they're not in the modernization portfolio per se, but they are new programs?
No, fair question. So I would tell you our focus is on those 6 modernization programs, but there are certainly some weapon systems that are needed here in the near term and perhaps even further on down the road that are integral to the modernization program. So all of these programs are looked at on an individual basis. And so I think you mentioned AMP-V and the howitzer. While those are not necessarily they're not necessarily in the modernization programs, they are still, as I speak to you today, still a very critical part of our inventory and still something we very much need. Remember, everybody, this is going to take a number of years. And so we're not going to just automatically stop funding the Apache or the Blackhawk because FARA and FLRAA are on the horizon. We still need to invest in those capabilities until FARA, FLRAA, or pick your weapon system is going to be ready for us to go into production. So there's a balance here. There is an absolute balance here between what we need today and what we're going to need tomorrow. That creates some friction. I'll be honest with you. That'll create some friction, and that's why we spend so much time in these deep dives trying to get this right.
Sir, we have one more question for you.
Sir, good morning. Bob Schultz, Krauss-Maffei Wegmann. We make the Leopard tank, Puma fighting vehicle with Rheinmetall. I wanted to give you a question not from the press, so a little bit of love, but a little bit challenging. If you see the public spat with the Navy looking to increase their top line a little bit, the Air Force getting the biggest increase, about 1%, and you think about the evolution that's going to come with the Space Force, from my perspective, it's hard to see how the Army can expect the top line to increase when there's these other very strategic competitors out there trying to vie for that budget. On top of that, I want to speak up for General Semenite and the Corps of Engineers. If you look at Defender 2020 in Poland, there's a lot of rivers over there, and those bridges don't handle some of those big, wonderful tanks that my company makes. So there's a lot of enablers out there that aren't getting the money that are going into the top 6. So my question really is, what's plan B? How do we move forward to cover all these things? At some point, I guess from my perspective, I think we have to make some really hard decisions. Thank you.
So I would agree with that, and I would tell you, you have to look at the totality of the budget. You can't just focus on one of the slices, okay? You can't just focus on research, development, acquisition. You can't just focus on end-strength and people, and you can't just focus on readiness. We have to strike that balance. Therein lies the challenge. You're absolutely right, and you're absolutely right that there's been a lot of talk lately about, what portion of the budget does the Army get, the Navy, the Air Force. We've got a new Space Force. Quite frankly, that's a little bit at levels above my pay grade, but I would tell you we are cognizant of that. But the Army, we know what we need to be a part of that joint all-domain operations and to be able to support the NDS. But I don't sugarcoat it. There are going to be some hard decisions in the future. Getting real growth in the top line is absolutely necessary, however, for us to realize and to continue to realize the gains that we've already achieved here in the last couple of years in our modernization portfolio.
Sir, thank you again for being here. Let's give General Horlander a big round of applause.